Hey guys, tonight we begin with villains. Biblical villains to be precise. The people Sunday school teachers use as object lessons in how not to live. Pharaoh, Jezebel, Herod, Judas. Names that need no introduction because they've been doing villain duty for thousands of years. But here's something nobody tells you about history's bad guys. They all had performance reviews, and most of them were passing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're flipping through scripture, and you keep meeting the same cast of terrible people. The tyrant who wouldn't free the slaves. The foreign queen who corrupted true worship. The paranoid king who murdered babies. The disciple who sold out God himself for the price of a used donkey. Simple stories, clear morals, obvious monsters. Except, here's the thing about villains. They rarely think they're villains. They think they're doing their jobs, making hard choices, protecting important things, and the truly uncomfortable part, the systems they worked within agreed with them. Tonight, we're going to humanize the people everyone loves to hate, not because they deserve it, not because we're excusing anything, but because flattening complex people into cartoon villains is how we avoid examining the systems that made their choices profitable. And those systems, they're still running. We're going to meet Pharaoh, who wasn't a mustache-twirling slave driver, but the CEO of a superpower whose entire economy depended on free labor. Every time Moses showed up asking for emancipation, Pharaoh heard, "Bankrupt your civilization." The hardened heart wasn't divine cruelty. It was economic anxiety on a national scale. We'll sit with Jezebel, the Phoenician princess who gets the villain edit for refusing to pretend she'd converted. Male kings had foreign wives and foreign gods scattered across Israel like a theological Airbnb. But Jezebel brought her religion openly and somehow became the Bible's shorthand for dangerous woman. Her crime? She wouldn't perform Hebrew piety for the cameras. We'll examine Herod the Great, who murdered his own children and also built the most magnificent temple in Jewish history. The baby killer of Bethlehem was also the economic miracle worker who created jobs, infrastructure, and architectural wonders. He was Rome's puppet and Judea's benefactor. Both things at the same time. The cognitive dissonance was the point. We'll reconsider Judas, who held the money bag and watched the numbers not add up. What if the betrayal wasn't greed, but panic? 30 pieces of silver wasn't retirement money. It was insulting. Maybe Judas thought he was forcing Jesus' hand, making him finally use that power everyone knew he had. The disciple who took the death predictions seriously and made the worst possible decision trying to prevent them. We'll meet Pilate, the middle manager who just wanted to survive his posting in the empire's most annoying province. A Roman governor washing his hands while the crowd made his decision for him. Every Passover a security nightmare. Every messianic movement a potential career-ending incident. The trial of Jesus as corporate risk management. And we'll sit across from Caiaphas, the high priest, who said one man should die so the nation could live. He wasn't wrong about Rome. Let movements get too big and empires crush everything. Spoiler alert, they destroyed Jerusalem anyway, 40 years later. But Caiaphas was playing the odds, choosing survival over principle, which is what most religious leaders do most of the time throughout all of history. Here's what we're not doing tonight. We're not excusing evil. We're not saying these choices were right. We're not running some kind of villain rehabilitation program where everyone gets a redemption arc and a book deal. Here's what we are doing. We're examining how systems create incentives, how power structures reward certain choices and punish others, how people operating rationally within broken systems do terrible things while genuinely believing they're protecting something important. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. If evil always looked like evil, we'd recognize it. If villains always seemed like villains, we'd resist them. The danger isn't the obvious monster. It's the reasonable person making defensible choices within a system that profits from harm. Every person we're meeting tonight had reasons, not excuses, reasons. They were protecting economies, preserving nations, maintaining order, managing risk, choosing the many over the one. Standard operating procedure, business as usual, which should terrify us more than simple villainy ever could. The Bible gives us clear bad guys because clear bad guys make clear lessons. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Jezebel was wicked. Herod was paranoid. Judas was greedy. Caiaphas was corrupt. Simple. But history doesn't have villains. It has people who made choices that benefited someone, usually themselves, often their institutions, always at someone else's expense. Tonight, we're going to complicate every simple story you thought you knew. We're going to find the human being underneath the Sunday school villain. We're going to examine the systems that made cruelty profitable and kindness expensive. And then, having thoroughly disturbed our comfortable categories, we're going to sleep. Because the gentle cynic's job isn't to make you feel better, it's to make you think harder. So let's meet the villains. The real ones, the human ones, the ones who had reasons. The pyramids didn't build themselves. Neither did the grain storage cities, the temples, the irrigation systems, the monuments that made Egypt the envy of every civilization within sailing distance. Someone had to move the stones. Someone had to dig the canals. Someone had to do the back-breaking labor that turned the Nile Valley into a superpower. That someone was Israel, and Pharaoh was the man sitting on top of an economy that would collapse without them. We meet him in Exodus as the villain, the hard-hearted tyrant who wouldn't let God's people go. Sunday school flannel boards show him sneering while Hebrew slaves suffer. The plagues rain down, and he keeps saying no, because apparently he enjoys frogs and boils and dead livestock. His heart gets harder with each miracle, and eventually God has to kill every firstborn in Egypt just to make him crack. Simple story, clear villain. Except, put yourself in his position for a moment. You're not a cartoon villain. You're the head of state for the most powerful civilization in the known world. Your economy runs on a specific fuel, free labor. Not just any free labor, skilled, generational, embedded labor. The Israelites aren't just moving bricks. They're running entire sectors of your infrastructure. The brick making, Israelite labor, the construction projects, Israelite expertise, the agricultural surplus that feeds your cities and funds your military, Israelite workforce in the fields. You're not dealing with a small population that could be easily replaced. The text tells us there were enough Israelites that Pharaoh feared they might join Egypt's enemies in war. We're talking about a significant percentage of your labor force, possibly the majority in certain industries. And then one day, two guys show up, Moses and Aaron. They're not asking for better working conditions. They're not negotiating for higher wages or shorter hours. They're asking you to let the entire workforce leave, permanently. Let my people go, they say. What you hear, bankrupt your civilization. Because that's what emancipation means when your GDP is built on slavery. It's not a moral question. It's an economic apocalypse. Every brick that stops being made is a construction project that halts. Every field that stops being worked is a harvest that fails. Every irrigation canal that stops being maintained is a flood waiting to happen. The Egyptian economy wasn't diversified. It was concentrated, specialized, dependent. And Moses just asked you to remove the foundation. So you say no. Of course you say no. Any rational leader would say no. And then the plagues start. Here's what nobody mentions about the plagues. They weren't random. They were targeted. Economic terrorism disguised as divine judgment. Each plague hit a specific sector of Egyptian infrastructure, systematically dismantling the systems that made Egypt powerful. The Nile turns to blood. That's not just gross. It's your primary water source, your transportation network, your fishing industry, your irrigation supply. Everything Egypt does flows through the Nile. Making it unusable is like cutting off a modern city's electricity, water, and internet simultaneously. You watch your economy start to hemorrhage, and Moses shows up again. Let my people go. You're a rational person. You do cost-benefit analysis. You calculate, how long can we survive without the Nile? How much damage has this done? Is it worse than losing our labor force? The math says, we can recover from this. We can't recover from emancipation. So you say no. The frogs come next, millions of them. In your house, your bedroom, your ovens, your kneading bowls. The smell alone, that thick, wet, rotting amphibian stench that gets into fabric and won't leave. You breathe through your mouth. It doesn't help. But more importantly, frogs in the grain storage means contamination. Frogs in the water supply means disease. Frogs everywhere means your agricultural system is compromised. Again, Moses appears. Let my people go. And here's where it gets interesting. You almost say yes. The text tells us Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, plead with the Lord to take the frogs away, and I will let the people go. You're negotiating. You're considering it. You're doing the math. Dead frogs everywhere versus no workforce. And then the frogs die, all at once. They're piled in heaps, and the land reeks, but the crisis is over. The immediate threat has passed, so you recalculate. The damage is done. The frogs are gone. But if you let the Israelites go now, you lose everything permanently. You'd be making an irreversible decision under duress, which is exactly what you're trained not to do as a leader. You harden your heart. The text says God hardened it. But let's be honest, you are already doing that math yourself. God just gets credit for what you were going to do anyway. The pattern repeats. Gnats, flies, livestock disease, boils, hail. Each plague targets something specific. The livestock disease hits your agricultural economy and your military transportation. Egyptian chariots needed horses. The hail destroys crops, specifically flax and barley, which means your textile industry and your beer production take simultaneous hits. And you keep saying no. Not because you're stupid, not because you enjoy suffering, because every time you run the numbers, emancipation is still worse than the plague. Here's what the plagues cost you: temporary damage, recoverable losses, short-term crisis management. Here's what emancipation costs you: permanent collapse, irreplaceable workforce, long-term economic death spiral. You're not being stubborn. You're being rational. The problem is that rationality within a broken system produces irrational outcomes. You're making perfectly logical choices that lead to national destruction because the system you're operating in is fundamentally unsustainable. But you can't see that because you're inside it. Let's zoom in on one moment: the negotiation after the locusts. The locusts have been threatened but haven't arrived yet. and Pharaoh's officials are panicking. The text preserves their words. How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined? Your own advisors are telling you to surrender. Egypt is ruined, and you almost do it. You call Moses back. You start negotiating terms. Go, serve the Lord your God. But which ones are to go? Moses says, we will go with our young and our old, with our sons and our daughters, with our flocks and our herds. And you balk, because that's not a religious festival. That's emigration. That's taking everything and not coming back. You can agree to let the men go worship for a few days. That's manageable. That's a religious accommodation. But taking the children, the elderly, the livestock, that's a nation leaving. So you say no again, and the locusts come, and they eat everything the hail didn't destroy, every green thing, every crop, every leaf. The land is stripped bare, and still you don't surrender. Because surrendering means admitting that your entire economic system was built on something unsustainable. It means acknowledging that Egypt's greatness depended on injustice, and without that injustice, Egypt is just another struggling nation with impressive architecture and no food. You can't admit that. Your legitimacy depends on Egyptian exceptionalism. You're Pharaoh. You're supposed to be semi-divine, the guarantor of Ma'at, the cosmic order that keeps Egypt prosperous and stable. If you admit that prosperity required enslaving an entire people, and that losing them means losing everything, you're admitting that Mehat was a lie. So you keep saying no, even when the darkness comes. 3 days of thick, tangible darkness that makes people stay where they are, unable to see each other. Even then, you try to negotiate. Go, serve the Lord. Only let your flocks and your herds remain behind. Moses refuses, and you snap. You tell him to get out, never come back. If you see his face again, you'll die. Which is the response of a man who knows he's losing but can't afford to admit it. The final plague is the one everyone remembers. The death of the firstborn. Every household in Egypt, from Pharaoh's palace to the prisoner in the dungeon, to the livestock in the fields, the firstborn die at midnight, including yours. Your son dies because you wouldn't let someone else's sons go free. The text doesn't give us Pharaoh's emotional response. It just says he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord, as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone." You've lost. Not just the negotiation, everything. Your son is dead. Your economy is shattered. Your nation has been systematically dismantled by plagues that targeted every sector of infrastructure. Your officials are terrified. Your people are mourning. And you're standing in the wreckage of the system you were trying to preserve. So you let them go. And then, and this is the part that makes you fully human, you change your mind. The text says, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people, and they said, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" You look at the empty labor camps, the halted construction projects, the fields with no one to work them, and you realize, we can't survive this. So you chase them. You mobilize 600 chariots and all the chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. You pursue them to the Red Sea, because bringing them back by force is the only option left. You've already lost everything else. Might as well gamble on military recapture. And we know how that ends. The sea splits. Israel crosses. You follow. The water comes back. You drown. The villain gets his comeuppance. The tyrant is destroyed. God's people are free. Simple story. Clear ending. Except, let's sit with Pharaoh for a moment, not the cartoon villain, the actual person who made these choices. He was operating within a system that made slavery economically necessary. He inherited that system. He didn't invent it. The text tells us the enslavement started generations earlier under a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. That Pharaoh looked at a growing Israelite population and made a calculated decision: enslave them before they become a threat. By the time our Pharaoh takes power, slavery isn't a policy choice. It's infrastructure. It's woven into every aspect of Egyptian life. The economy depends on it. The building projects assume it. The agricultural output requires it. And he's supposed to voluntarily dismantle all of that because a foreign god says so. Put yourself there. You're the leader of a superpower. You have obligations to your people, to your officials, to the system that keeps everything running. Someone shows up with miracles and demands you destroy your own economy for moral reasons you don't share, serving a god you don't worship, to free people you consider necessary labor. What do? If you're rational, you say no. If you're responsible to your nation's interests, you say no. If you're trying to preserve stability and order and the prosperity of millions of Egyptians who aren't enslaved, you say no. The problem isn't that Pharaoh was irrational. The problem is that he was rational within an evil system. And rationality within evil systems produces evil outcomes while feeling completely justified. That's the horror of it. Pharaoh probably slept fine most nights. He was doing his job, making hard choices, protecting Egyptian interests. Any other leader in his position would have done the same thing. He wasn't uniquely cruel. He was systemically compliant. The hardened heart makes perfect sense when you understand what he was protecting. Not just his own power, though that too, but an entire civilization's way of life. Egypt's greatness was real. The architecture, the art, the agricultural surplus, the military might, the cultural achievements, all real, all built on slavery. And he couldn't separate the greatness from the injustice because they were the same thing. So when Moses showed up asking for freedom, Pharaoh heard, "Destroy everything good about Egypt." And he said no, over and over, through plague after plague, until his own son was dead and his army was drowned and his nation was broken. Not because he was a monster, because he was a leader doing math. And the math said, we can't afford to lose them. The truly disturbing part, he was right. Egypt couldn't afford to lose them. The economy did collapse. The superpower declined. The system that made Egypt great required injustice. And without that injustice, Egypt was just another nation struggling to feed itself. Which means the villain was telling the truth. The system really did depend on slavery. Emancipation really did mean economic disaster. And choosing morality over prosperity really did cost everything. That's not a defense of Pharaoh. That's an indictment of the system. Because here's what we learn from Pharaoh. When your prosperity depends on someone else's oppression, you will rationalize anything to preserve it. You'll endure frogs, flies, boils, hail, locusts, and darkness. You'll watch your nation be systematically destroyed. You'll lose your own son, and you'll still think you're making the responsible choice, because the alternative is admitting that everything you built was built wrong, that the greatness was never really great, that the prosperity was always stolen, that the system you've been defending should have been dismantled generations ago. Pharaoh couldn't admit that, so he drowned in the Red Sea, chasing the workforce he couldn't afford to lose, still doing the math, still protecting the system, still certain he was right. Her name means "Where is the prince?" in Phoenician, which is either a beautiful tribute to Baal, the storm god her people worshipped, or the setup for the most notorious character assassination in biblical literature? Probably both. Jezebel arrives in Israel around 870 BCE as part of a political package deal. Her father, Ethbaal, king of Tyre and Sidon, needed an alliance. King Ahab of Israel needed Phoenician trade routes, naval technology, and access to Mediterranean commerce. The marriage contract was signed before she ever saw her future husband. She was currency, a diplomatic transaction with a pulse, and she came with terms. Because here's what nobody mentions when they're busy calling her the wickedest woman in Scripture. Jezebel didn't sneak her gods into Israel like contraband. She brought them officially, publicly, probably contractually. Royal marriages in the ancient Near East weren't just about linking families. They were about linking pantheons. When a foreign princess married into a new kingdom, she brought her religious entourage with her, her priests, her rituals, her gods. This wasn't rebellion. This was protocol. Every neighboring kingdom did it. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, many of them foreign princesses, and he built shrines for their gods all over Jerusalem. Moabite shrines, Ammonite shrines, Sidonian shrines. The text criticizes him for it eventually, but while he's doing it, it's just standard diplomatic procedure. Ahab's own father, Omri, had foreign alliances that certainly involved religious accommodations. Foreign wives meant foreign worship. That's how international relations worked. But when Jezebel does it, she becomes the villain. When Jezebel builds a temple to Baal and supports 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, suddenly it's an existential threat to Israelite identity. The gender dynamics are doing a lot of work here. Because male kings had foreign wives, constantly, they built temples to foreign gods as political courtesy. They participated in syncretistic worship, a little Yahweh here, a little Baal there, whatever keeps the trade routes open and the neighboring kingdoms friendly. But they were still men, still kings, still in control of the narrative. Jezebel was a woman who refused to perform conversion. She didn't pretend to adopt Israelite religion. She didn't play the dutiful foreign bride who gratefully embraces her new people's superior God. She didn't perform Hebrew piety for public consumption. She just kept worshipping Baal. Openly, unapologetically, as if she had every right to her own religious identity, which, contractually, she probably did. Imagine being her for a moment. You're a Phoenician princess, raised in Tyre, one of the wealthiest, most cosmopolitan cities in the Mediterranean. Tyre had glass manufacturing, purple dye production, naval supremacy, trade networks spanning 3 continents. Your people were literate, urban, sophisticated, and then you get shipped off to marry the king of Israel. Israel in the 9th century BCE was not Tyre. It was smaller, poorer, more agricultural, more religiously rigid. The capital, Samaria, was new. Ahab's father had only founded it a generation earlier. It was still under construction. You arrive in a half-built city in a kingdom that considers itself chosen by a god you've never worshipped, surrounded by people who speak a different language and follow customs you don't share. Your marriage contract, almost certainly, included provisions for your religious practice. That was standard. You would have negotiated for space to worship your gods, support for your priests, permission to maintain your identity, because that's what kept foreign princesses from becoming completely powerless in hostile courts. Religion was leverage. As long as you had your gods, your priests, your rituals, you had a community, a support network, people whose loyalty was to you, not to your husband's political interests. So you build the temple to Baal. You fund the prophets. You maintain Phoenician religious practice in the heart of Israel, and the Yahweh-only faction loses their minds. Enter Elijah. The prophet shows up like a thunderstorm in human form and announces there will be no rain in Israel except by his word. It's a direct challenge. Baal was the storm god, the god of rain and fertility. Elijah is essentially saying, your God is unemployed, and I'm about to prove it. The drought lasts 3 years, 3 years of crops failing, livestock dying, wells drying up, the land cracking under relentless sun, the smell of dust everywhere, in your clothes, your hair, your mouth. You breathe and taste dirt, and everyone blames Jezebel's gods. The text tells us that Ahab searched everywhere for Elijah during the drought. He sent to every nation and kingdom, making them swear they hadn't seen the prophet. He's desperate. His kingdom is dying of thirst, and the man who cursed the rain has vanished. But here's what's interesting. Ahab doesn't blame Jezebel. He doesn't divorce her, doesn't execute her, doesn't shut down the Baal temple. He keeps looking for Elijah, which suggests that Ahab, the actual king, the actual decision maker, didn't see his wife's religious practice as the problem. The drought was Elijah's curse, not Baal's fault, but the prophetic narrative needs a villain. And Jezebel is right there, foreign and female and unapologetic. Perfect. The showdown at Mount Carmel is where Jezebel's villainy gets cemented. Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal to a contest. Build an altar, call on your God to send fire. We'll see who answers. The prophets of Baal dance and shout and cut themselves all day. Nothing happens. Elijah mocks them. Maybe your God is sleeping. Maybe he's gone to the bathroom. Shout louder. Then Elijah prays, fire falls, the altar burns. The people declare Yahweh is God, and Elijah orders the execution of all 450 prophets of Baal, slaughtered at the Kishon Brook. All of them. The text presents this as righteous victory. False prophets eliminated. True God vindicated. Justice served. But put yourself in Jezebel's position for a moment. You just lost 450 people. Not enemies, your people, your religious community, the priests you brought from Phoenicia or trained in Israel, the people who maintained your cultural identity in a foreign land. They weren't soldiers, they were clergy, and they were massacred without trial, without warning, on the order of a prophet who then ran away into the wilderness. The text tells us Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah. So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. She's threatening him, promising revenge, and the narrative presents this as proof of her wickedness, the evil queen threatening God's prophet. But she's a widow of 450 murdered men. She's responding to a massacre. She's promising exactly what Elijah just did, death to religious enemies. When Elijah does it, it's zeal for Yahweh. When Jezebel threatens it, it's murderous rage. The double standard is doing backflips. Let's talk about the Naboth incident, because this is where Jezebel's reputation as the embodiment of evil gets fully established. Ahab wants a vineyard. It belongs to a man named Naboth, and it's right next to the palace, perfect for a vegetable garden. Ahab offers to buy it or trade for it. Naboth refuses. The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. It's a religious refusal. The land is ancestral, and Israelite law prohibited selling ancestral land permanently. Naboth is following the rules. Ahab accepts this. He goes home sullen and resentful, lies on his bed, turns away his face, and refuses to eat. He's pouting. The king of Israel is pouting because he can't have a vegetable garden. Jezebel finds him like this and asks what's wrong. He explains, and she says, and the text preserves her exact words. "Do you now govern Israel? Arise and eat bread and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth." Then she writes letters in Ahab's name, seals them with his seal, and sends them to the elders of Naboth's city. The letters instruct them to proclaim a fast, seat Naboth in a prominent place, and have 2 worthless men accuse him of cursing God and the king, then stone him. They do it. Naboth dies. Jezebel tells Ahab, "The vineyard is yours." The text presents this as ultimate wickedness. Jezebel the schemer, Jezebel the murderer, Jezebel who destroys innocent men to satisfy her husband's whims. And yes, it's murder. It's judicial corruption. It's abuse of power. But let's zoom out for a moment. What Jezebel just did was eminent domain. Royal confiscation of property for state purposes. It was standard operating procedure in every kingdom surrounding Israel. The king wants land. The king takes land. Sometimes he pays for it. Sometimes he just takes it. In Mesopotamian law codes, in Egyptian practice, in Phoenician custom, where Jezebel was from, the king's desire for property was sufficient justification for acquisition. You might have to manufacture a legal pretext, which is exactly what Jezebel did, but the outcome was never in question. The king wants it, the king gets it. Israel was the exception, not the rule. Israelite law had these weird provisions about ancestral land, about jubilee years, about property returning to original families. It had protections for individuals against royal seizure that didn't exist anywhere else in the ancient Near East. Jezebel didn't know that, or didn't care. She saw a king who wanted land and couldn't take it, and she thought, what kind of kingship is this? What kind of king is governed by a farmer's religious scruples? So she did what any Phoenician royal would do. She solved the problem. The fact that she had to use false accusations and mob justice suggests she knew she couldn't just confiscate it openly. Israelite custom wouldn't allow it. So she worked around the custom, created a legal fiction, made it look like Naboth deserved death for religious crimes. It's evil, but it's also entirely normal royal behavior everywhere except Israel. And that's what makes Jezebel dangerous to the biblical narrative. She's not an aberration. She's a reminder that Israel's legal protections for individuals were the aberration. She's what normal monarchy looked like. She's what power did when it wanted something and had the authority to take it. She's the system functioning exactly as designed, just not Israel's system. When Elijah confronts Ahab about Naboth's murder, he doesn't blame Jezebel, he blames Ahab. Have you killed and also taken possession? The guilt belongs to the king, but the narrative memory shifts it to the queen, because queens make better villains than kings, especially foreign queens who never pretended to convert. Jezebel's death is famous. After Ahab dies and their son Joram becomes king, a prophet anoints Jehu as king with instructions to destroy Ahab's house. Jehu arrives in Jezreel, and Jezebel hears he's coming. The text tells us she painted her eyes and adorned her head and looked out of the window. She puts on makeup, does her hair, and looks out the window as Jehu arrives. The makeup detail is significant because it gets used for centuries as proof of her vanity, her seductiveness, her shameless sexuality. Painted Jezebel becomes shorthand for a woman who uses beauty as a weapon. But think about what's actually happening. Jehu has just murdered her son. He's coming to kill her next. She knows this. There's no escape, no negotiation, no mercy coming. So she puts on her royal regalia. She does her makeup, arranges her hair, and presents herself at the window not as a victim, but as a queen. She's choosing how she'll be seen in her final moments. She's refusing to die cowering or begging. She calls down to Jehu, "Is it peace, you Zimri, murderer of your master?" Zimri was a commander who assassinated his king and then died 7 days later. She's comparing Jehu to a failed usurper. She's insulting him with her last breath. Jehu calls up to the window, "Who is on my side? Who?" 2 or 3 eunuchs look out. He says, "Throw her down." They throw her down. She hits the ground. The horses trample her. Blood spatters on the wall. Jehu goes inside to eat and drink, because apparently regicide makes you hungry, and then says, "See now to this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter." Even he acknowledges her royal status, but when they go to bury her, the dogs have eaten her. Only her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands remain. The text presents this as fulfillment of prophecy. Elijah had predicted that dogs would eat Jezebel's flesh in Jezreel. Divine judgment executed, wicked queen destroyed. But let's sit with what actually happened. A foreign woman married into a kingdom that never accepted her. She maintained her religious identity, which was probably her contractual right. She supported her husband's reign, which was definitely her job. She exercised royal power in ways that were normal everywhere except Israel. And for this, she was thrown out a window, trampled by horses, and eaten by dogs. Her crime wasn't murder. Israelite kings murdered plenty, and most of them died in bed. Her crime wasn't idolatry. Israelite kings built shrines to foreign gods constantly, and most of them got normal burials. Her crime was being foreign and female and unashamed of both. She wouldn't assimilate, wouldn't convert, wouldn't perform the expected feminine piety that would have made her safe. She remained Phoenician in Israel, remained Baal worshipping in Yahweh's land, remained powerful in a role that expected submission, and the prophetic narrative punished her for it in ways it never punished male kings for identical behavior. Think about Solomon. 700 wives, 300 concubines, built shrines to Chemosh, Molech, Ashtoreth, gods that required child sacrifice. The text says, his wives turned away his heart after other gods. His punishment? He lost some territory. His son's kingdom got divided. He died peacefully and got buried in Jerusalem. Jezebel promoted prophets of Baal, who didn't practice child sacrifice despite later propaganda, and got thrown out a window. The math isn't mathing, unless the real crime was being a woman who wouldn't pretend. Jezebel became a name you called dangerous women, women who were too sexual, too powerful, too foreign, too independent. The book of Revelation uses her name as an insult for a woman in the church at Thyatira who was teaching things the author didn't like. Not even the same person, just the same archetype. Woman with religious authority who won't submit. Call her Jezebel, and you don't have to engage with her arguments. The name does the work. For 3,000 years, Jezebel has meant woman who refuses her assigned role, woman who exercises power without apology, woman who maintains her own identity in spaces that demand assimilation, woman who won't perform the expected script. And here's the deeply uncomfortable question. What if that was her only real crime? What if the Baal worship was contractual? What if the prophet massacre was response to religious violence, not initiation of it? What if the Naboth incident was Jezebel doing exactly what Phoenician queens were trained to do? Solve problems for their husbands using available legal mechanisms. What if she was just a foreign woman trying to survive in a hostile court by maintaining the only power base she had, her religious community and her royal authority? The text never lets her speak for herself. Every word we have about Jezebel comes from her enemies. the prophets who hated her gods, the historians who blamed her for Israel's apostasy, the later editors who used her name as shorthand for everything wrong with foreign influence. We never hear her version. We never hear why she thought supporting Baal worship was worth the political cost. We never hear what she thought about Israelite religion, about Yahweh, about the prophets who kept threatening her household. We never hear what it felt like to be a foreign woman in a kingdom that considered foreignness itself a form of pollution. We just get the villain edit, the painted woman, the murderous queen, the wicked Jezebel. And that name, that cursed, powerful name echoed through centuries, attached to any woman who dared to lead without apologizing, to worship differently, to refuse assimilation. She died trampled and eaten by dogs, unmourned except by the eunuchs who served her. But her name survived, not as a person, as a warning, a reminder of what happens to women who won't perform the expected role, who won't convert, won't submit, won't pretend to be smaller than they are. The system couldn't tolerate her, so it threw her out a window and let the dogs finish the job, and called it justice. The temple took 46 years to build. Herod started the project in 20 BCE, and it wasn't finished until 64 CE, 6 years before Rome burned it to the ground. He never saw it completed, but he saw enough. White marble and gold, visible from miles away, gleaming in the sun like a monument to either devotion or compensation. Probably both. The retaining walls alone required stones weighing 400 tons, cut, transported, lifted into place with technology that still makes engineers nervous when they do the math. This was not a renovation. This was a statement. Herod the Great, was actually part of his title, which tells you something about his brand management. Expanded the Second Temple into something that rivaled Solomon's mythical original. He doubled the Temple Mount's size, built massive porticos, created the Court of the Gentiles so even non-Jews could participate in the economy of pilgrimage. It employed thousands: priests, guards, merchants, money changers, animal sellers, maintenance workers, administrative staff. The temple wasn't just a religious center, it was Jerusalem's economic engine. Pilgrims came from across the Mediterranean for festivals. They brought money, lots of money. Herod made that possible. He also put a golden eagle, Rome's symbol, over the temple gate, which tells you everything about the schizophrenia of his reign. Build the most magnificent Jewish temple in history, then decorate it with the icon of the empire that conquered you. Honor God, honor Caesar, and hope nobody notices the contradiction. Spoiler, they noticed. A group of young men, encouraged by 2 rabbis, climbed up and hacked the eagle down with axes. Herod had them burned alive. The rabbis too. This happened when Herod was dying, probably in early 4 BCE, and he was past the point of caring about public opinion. The eagle incident doesn't make it into the Herod the baby killer narrative that dominates Christmas pageants, but it should, because it's the same man, the builder and the burner, the patron of Jewish religious glory and the executor of Jewish religious protesters. He contained multitudes, violent, contradictory multitudes. Herod's origin story reads like a political thriller written by someone who doesn't believe in happy endings. His father, Antipater, was an Idumean, Edomite in older terminology. Edom was the kingdom south of Judea, descendants of Esau if you believe the genealogies. The Idumeans had been forcibly converted to Judaism by the Hasmonean king John Hyrcanus around 125 BCE. Converted at sword point, circumcised or die. So Herod was technically Jewish, but the technically was doing all the work. His father was a convert from a people Israel had despised for centuries. His mother, Cypros, was a Nabatean Arab. He was ethnically mixed, religiously suspect, and politically brilliant. Antipater had served as advisor to the Hasmonean kings, playing kingmaker during their civil wars. When Rome showed up in 63 BCE, Pompey, the great conquering Jerusalem, entering the Holy of Holies just to see what was in there. Antipater immediately switched sides. He became Rome's man in Judea, and he raised his son to understand that survival meant usefulness. If you're valuable to the people with power, you stay alive. The moment you stop being useful, you stop breathing. Herod learned the lesson well. By his 20s, Herod was governor of Galilee. He dealt with bandit problems efficiently, which meant executions without trial. The Sanhedrin in Jerusalem summoned him to answer for this. Jewish law required trials even for bandits. Herod showed up to the hearing wearing purple and surrounded by armed guards. The Sanhedrin got quiet very quickly. Only one member, a Pharisee named Sameas, spoke up. He warned that if they let Herod go unpunished, he would one day punish them. Herod remembered that. Years later, when he became king and executed most of the Sanhedrin, he spared Sameas. Respect for the man who'd had the courage to threaten him when it mattered. Herod's rise to actual kingship was neither clean nor inevitable. When the Parthians invaded in 40 BCE, Parthia being Rome's great eastern rival, they installed a Hasmonean prince as puppet king. Herod fled. He went to Rome, met with Mark Antony and Octavian, not yet enemies, not yet Augustus, and somehow convinced the Roman Senate to name him King of the Jews, a title with no kingdom. He had to conquer it, which took 3 years, Roman legions, and a siege of Jerusalem that ended with Herod begging the Roman commander not to slaughter everyone inside. Not out of mercy, he needed subjects to rule. You can't be king of corpses. He married Mariamne, a Hasmonean princess, to legitimize his claim. She was beautiful, well-connected, and from the royal line everyone actually respected. He loved her. This will be important later. Herod's reign, once he finally secured it, was a masterclass in walking tightropes while juggling knives. He had to keep Rome happy. They could remove him any time. He had to keep Jewish religious authorities calm. They could delegitimize him completely. He had to manage the aristocracy, who resented him as an upstart, and he had to maintain his own family, who were constantly plotting against each other and occasionally against him. The building projects were part of the strategy. Masada, the fortress on a plateau in the Judean desert, with palaces and storerooms and water systems that could sustain a siege for years. Herod built that. It was a doomsday bunker disguised as a royal retreat. Herodium, an artificial mountain with a palace fortress on top and his eventual tomb inside. He built that. It was ego made of stone, Caesarea Maritima, an entirely new city, with an artificial harbour, aqueducts, a hippodrome, and a temple to Augustus. He built that. It was a love letter to Rome written in marble and concrete, visible proof that he was Rome's loyal servant. And the temple, always the temple. Because if you're a half-Idumean king ruling Jews who don't think you're Jewish enough, you build them the most magnificent house of God in the world. You employ their priests. You facilitate their pilgrimage economy. You make worship so glorious that maybe they'll forget to ask about your mother's genealogy. The temple was insurance. Political, religious, economic insurance. But insurance doesn't cover paranoia. And Herod's paranoia was spectacular. He executed his wife Mariamne in 29 BCE, convinced she was plotting against him. The evidence was questionable. The accusers were biased, but Herod believed it, or talked himself into believing it, and had her strangled. Then he regretted it so intensely that he reportedly called her name in his sleep, ordered servants to bring her to him as if she was still alive, and fell into a depression that lasted months. He loved her, and he killed her. Both things were true. He executed her mother, Alexandra, shortly after. She definitely had been plotting, trying to position her son as the legitimate Hasmonean heir. Herod drowned him in a swimming pool and made it look like an accident. The boy was 17. Herod executed 3 of his own sons at different points in his reign. Alexander and Aristobulus, Mariamne's sons, which meant they had Hasmonean blood, were strangled in 7 BCE after years of suspicion and a trial before Augustus himself. Augustus had tried to reconcile them with their father. It didn't take. Antipater, Herod's eldest son by his first wife, was executed 5 days before Herod's own death. Antipater had been caught plotting to poison his father. The evidence this time was solid. Augustus reportedly joked that he'd rather be Herod's pig than Herod's son. The joke worked in Greek. Hais and pig and huios, son, sounded similar. And it was funny because Herod, being Jewish, didn't eat pork. His pigs were safer than his children. But here's the thing about Herod's paranoia. Everyone actually was plotting against him. His sons wanted power. The Hasmonean faction wanted their dynasty back. The Pharisees wanted a more religiously observant king. Rome wanted stability and tribute, and if he couldn't provide it, they'd find someone who could. His own brother had tried to seduce Mariamne. His sister Salome constantly whispered accusations about everyone around him, usually true, sometimes fabricated, always designed to make herself indispensable. The court was a snake pit, and Herod was the biggest snake, which meant he knew exactly how snakes behaved. When everyone is actually plotting, is it still paranoia? Or is it just accurate threat assessment? The Bethlehem massacre, the slaughter of the innocents, the baby killing that makes Herod the Christmas villain, appears only in Matthew's Gospel. No other source mentions it, not Luke, not the historians Josephus or Nicholas of Damascus, who wrote extensively about Herod and didn't shy away from listing his atrocities. This is suspicious, not because Herod wouldn't have done it, he absolutely would have. A report of a new king of the Jews being born in Bethlehem, a threat to his dynasty wrapped in messianic prophecy. He'd have responded with overwhelming force. Killing all male children under 2 in a small village fits his pattern perfectly. But Bethlehem in 4 BCE was tiny, maybe 300 people total. The number of male infants under 2 would have been perhaps a dozen, maybe 20. In the context of Herod's other massacres, executing 45 members of the Sanhedrin, killing hundreds of Pharisees who opposed him, the mass executions of anyone suspected of supporting his rivals, 20 babies in a village barely registers. It's terrible, but it's not historically notable enough to make it into the official records, which is either evidence it didn't happen, or evidence that it was so minor compared to his other atrocities that nobody bothered writing it down. Both options are horrifying. Matthew's Gospel needs the massacre for narrative purposes. It parallels Moses, creates the flight to Egypt, establishes Jesus as the survivor of royal violence. Whether it happened historically or theologically, it's doing work in the story. And it fits the man. Herod, in his final years, was a nightmare of illness and rage. Josephus describes symptoms that sound like chronic kidney disease, gangrene, intestinal pain, difficulty breathing, and convulsions. His body was rotting while he was still alive. He knew he was dying, and he knew nobody would mourn him. So he made a plan. Herod ordered all the distinguished men of Judea, leaders, aristocrats, influential figures, to be locked in the hippodrome at Jericho. He gave his sister Salome and her husband instructions. The moment he died, execute them all. His reasoning? When he died, there would be rejoicing throughout Judea. He hated this, so he arranged for there to be mourning instead. Force the nation to grieve. If they won't mourn me, they'll mourn someone. Salome didn't follow through. When Herod died, she released the prisoners. The nation rejoiced after all. But the plan, the sheer vindictive pettiness of forcing a nation to mourn against its will, that's pure Herod. Control everything, even the emotional response to your death. He died in Jericho in early 4th of BCE, probably March. His body was carried in a golden bier to Herodium, the mountain palace he'd built as his monument. The funeral procession was spectacular. Purple and gold, incense and spices, hundreds of servants, the whole theatre of royal death. They buried him inside the mountain. Archaeologists found the tomb in 2007. It had been smashed to pieces in antiquity, probably during the Jewish revolt against Rome. Rebels destroying the grave of the half-Idumean king, who'd collaborated with the empire. Even his tomb couldn't rest in peace. Herod's legacy is impossible to summarize cleanly. He murdered his way to the throne and kept it through brutality and cunning. He executed family members on suspicion and enemies on principle. He was Rome's puppet, dancing when they pulled the strings, building temples to Augustus while claiming to serve the God of Israel. But he also created an economic boom. The building projects employed thousands. The new harbor at Caesarea opened trade routes. The expanded temple made Jerusalem a pilgrimage destination that funneled wealth into Judea for decades. He kept the peace for 33 years in a region that was never peaceful. No successful revolts, no Parthian invasions, no Roman sackings during his reign. He was a monster. And he was effective. And those two things aren't contradictory. They're often correlated. Effective rulers in the ancient world were frequently monstrous. Gentle kings didn't last. Merciful emperors got assassinated. Herod lasted because he was willing to do what needed to be done. And what needed to be done was usually violent. The impossible position he occupied, Rome's puppet pretending to be a Jewish king while never being Jewish enough for anyone, required constant performance. He had to be Jewish enough to legitimize his rule, but Roman enough to keep his patrons happy. He had to worship Yahweh publicly while honoring Augustus politically. He had to enforce Jewish law while accommodating Roman authority. He had to be both, fully, simultaneously, and neither identity would let him rest. The golden eagle over the temple gate was the perfect symbol. It said, "I am king here, and Rome is emperor everywhere. And if you don't like the contradiction, take it up with the legions." The young men who tore it down understood what it meant. So did Herod when he had them burned. You don't get to reject the contradiction. You live in it or you die. Those are the options. Herod chose to live, and he made everyone around him pay the cost of his survival. His sons divided his kingdom after his death. Archelaus got Judea, Antipas got Galilee, Philip got the territories northeast of the Sea of Galilee. None of them were called the Great. None of them built anything remotely comparable to their father's projects. Archelaus was so incompetent that Rome removed him after 10 years and turned Judea into a directly governed province, which is how we get Pontius Pilate 30 years later. But that's another story. Herod's buildings outlasted him by decades. The temple stood until 70 CE, when Rome destroyed it during the Jewish revolt. Masada held out until 73 CE, the last fortress to fall, where Jewish rebels chose mass suicide over Roman slavery. Caesarea remained a major city for centuries. The retaining walls of the Temple Mount still stand. You can see them today. Massive stones fit together so precisely that you can't slide a knife blade between them. Herod's engineering, surviving 2,000 years of earthquakes, wars, and empires rising and falling on top of them. The man was a nightmare, but he built things that lasted, and perhaps that's the most disturbing part. We remember him for the babies, possibly fictional, definitely symbolic, and forget that he shaped the landscape of first-century Judea more than any other single person. Jesus preached in Herod's buildings, walked through Herod's gates, was tried in a city connected to Jerusalem by Herod's roads. The stage on which the gospel story unfolded was built by a paranoid half-Idumean king who murdered his way to power and stayed there by being useful to Rome. History doesn't care about your motives. It cares about what you built and whether it was still standing when you died. Herod built monuments and nightmares. Both survived him. 30 pieces of silver weighed about half a pound. 420 grams of metal, give or take. In today's money, accounting for silver's commodity value, not historical purchasing power, that's maybe $300, $350 if the market's good. This is what Judas Iscariot received for betraying the Son of God. A used laptop's worth of silver, not retirement money, not blood money worth retiring on, not enough to disappear to Alexandria or Rome and start over with a new name and a beach house, barely enough to insult him properly. The Gospel of Matthew tells us this was the fulfillment of prophecy. Zechariah's 30 pieces of silver, the price of the rejected shepherd. Theologically, it works. The number had to be 30 because the prophecy said 30. But practically, 30 pieces of silver was what you paid for a slave killed by an ox. Exodus 21:32. Compensation for damaged property, the standardized payout for a human life at its most expendable. The chief priests weren't offering Judas a fortune. They were offering him slave death money for the man he'd followed for 3 years, and he took it, which raises the question nobody asks during Passion Week services. Why? If Judas was greedy, the standard explanation, the one that makes him easy to hate, why accept such a pathetic amount? Why not negotiate? The chief priest needed Jesus arrested quietly, without a riot. Passover week in Jerusalem was a security nightmare. Thousands of pilgrims celebrating liberation from empire while living under empire, all crammed into a city that couldn't hold them. Tensions high, Roman soldiers watching from the fortress Antonia, waiting for an excuse. They needed this done carefully. Judas had leverage. He could have asked for more. He didn't. Judas Iscariot. The name itself is a problem. Iscariot probably means man from Kerioth, a town in southern Judea. If that's accurate, Judas was the only disciple not from Galilee, the only outsider in a movement of northern provincials following a Galilean teacher. Or Iscariot might derive from Sicarii, the dagger men, Jewish assassins who killed Roman collaborators in crowds during festivals. The zealot connection, the revolutionary angle. Or it's a Greek corruption of the Latin sicarius, meaning betrayer or murderer, applied retroactively after the fact. We don't actually know. What we do know, Judas held the money bag. John's Gospel tells us this explicitly. Judas was the treasurer, the group's accountant, the one who handled donations, paid for supplies, distributed alms to the poor. This was not a ceremonial position. Someone had to track income and expenses. Someone had to make sure 12 men plus their teacher, plus the women who traveled with them, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and others who Luke mentions provided for them out of their own means, had enough to eat. Someone had to pay for lodging when they couldn't find hospitality. Someone had to purchase bread, dried fish, oil, wine. Judas did the math, and the math wasn't great. Jesus' movement ran on donations from supporters, most of whom weren't wealthy. A few women of means helped. Joanna was married to Herod Antipas's household manager, which meant she had access to money, but mostly it was small contributions. A denarius here, a few loaves there, hospitality from sympathizers. Income, irregular and unpredictable. Expenses, 13 plus people eating daily. Any accountant looks at that and gets nervous. Now add Jesus' messaging. Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Cool, inspiring, terrible financial planning. Do not worry about tomorrow. Beautiful teaching, horrifying budgeting advice. Sell everything you have and give to the poor, then come follow me. This is how you end up with more mouths to feed and less money to feed them. Judas watched donations come in. He watched expenses go out. He watched the gap between them narrow. And he watched Jesus talk constantly about going to Jerusalem to die. Not going to Jerusalem to overthrow the Romans. Not going to Jerusalem to claim the throne of David. Going to Jerusalem to die. This was not the plan Judas had signed up for. None of the disciples had signed up for this. Peter rebuked Jesus for it. This shall never happen to you, and God called Satan for his trouble. The sons of Zebedee were still asking about sitting at Jesus' right and left hand in the kingdom, as if there would be thrones and positions and an actual government. They weren't listening, or they were listening and refusing to believe. Judas was listening. He held the money. He was used to dealing with reality in concrete terms. Numbers don't lie. Income, expenses, projections. These things tell you the truth even when people won't. And the truth was, this movement was heading toward a cliff. Maybe Judas thought he could stop it. Maybe he thought he could force Jesus' hand. This is the generous reading, the one that makes Judas something other than purely greedy or demonically possessed. Maybe Judas believed, really believed, that Jesus was the Messiah, and that meant Jesus had power. Real power. The kind that could overthrow Rome, restore Israel, establish the kingdom everyone was waiting for. But Jesus wouldn't use it. He kept talking about suffering and death instead of victory and thrones. He kept saying, the Son of Man must be betrayed, must be handed over, must die, must, as if it were inevitable, as if he wanted it. Judas had seen the miracles, blind men seeing, lame men walking, dead girls getting up from their beds, storms stopping mid-wind. He'd seen Jesus feed thousands with a kid's lunch. He'd watched demons beg for permission to leave. This man had power, and he was wasting it on parables and foot washing. So maybe Judas went to the chief priest not to betray Jesus, but to force the confrontation, arrest him, put him in danger, make him finally use the power everyone knew he had, make him be the Messiah they needed instead of the one he kept insisting he was. It's a theory. It makes Judas tragic instead of evil, desperate instead of greedy, a true believer who broke bad trying to force God's hand. The problem with the theory is that Judas hanged himself afterward. Matthew says he felt remorse, tried to return the money, and when the chief priest refused it, what is that to us? That's your responsibility. He threw the silver into the temple and went out and hanged himself. Acts says he bought a field with the money and fell headlong in it, his body bursting open. The accounts don't match, but both agree. Judas died badly, and soon. If he'd been trying to force Jesus' hand, expecting a miracle, expecting divine intervention, expecting Jesus to finally unleash the power and overthrow the authorities. The crucifixion would have destroyed that hope completely. Jesus didn't fight back. He didn't call down legions of angels. He didn't stop it. He died, and Judas couldn't live with what he'd done. But let's sit with the other possibility, the darker one. What if Judas had simply stopped believing? Not in God, not in miracles, but in this particular movement's viability. He'd spent 3 years following Jesus, watching crowds gather and disperse, watching miracles that didn't translate into political change, watching Jesus deliberately antagonize the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, everyone with power, without building a coalition to replace them. Jesus had popularity, but no strategy. He had followers, but no army. He had momentum, but no plan for what to do with it. And he kept talking about dying. From an accountant's perspective, this is a failing venture. You don't pour more resources into something that's announcing its own bankruptcy. Maybe Judas went to the chief priest because he saw the end coming anyway and decided to get something out of it. 30 pieces of silver. Insultingly little, but more than he'd have after the Romans crucified Jesus and scattered the disciples. Cut your losses. Salvage what you can. It's cold. It's rational. It's what accountants do when the numbers stop adding up. The kiss in Gethsemane is the detail that haunts the story. Jesus is praying. The disciples are sleeping. They can't stay awake even though he's asked them to, even though he's clearly in agony. Judas arrives with a crowd, chief priests' guards, Roman soldiers, torches and weapons, and Judas identifies Jesus with a kiss. Greetings, Rabbi, and a kiss on the cheek, the signal they'd agreed on, the one that says, "This man here, this is the one you want," which means the guards didn't know what Jesus looked like. Stop and sit with that. The man had been teaching in the temple courts for days. He'd overturned tables in the court of the Gentiles. He'd argued with Pharisees publicly. He'd ridden into Jerusalem on a donkey with crowds shouting Hosanna and throwing cloaks on the road, and the people arresting him needed someone to point him out. How famous was this movement really? In Christian theology, Jesus is the center of history, the hinge point, the most important person who ever lived. But in first century Jerusalem during Passover week, he was one itinerant preacher among many. The city was full of prophets, teachers, holy men, and troublemakers. Pilate was dealing with security threats constantly. The chief priests had a list of people to watch. Jesus was on the list, but he wasn't the only name. The kiss wasn't just betrayal, it was identification. A practical necessity because the authorities didn't actually know who they were arresting. This is humbling if you think about it too long. The Son of God needed to be identified by a friend because his enemies couldn't pick him out of a crowd. Jesus calls Judas friend in Matthew's account. Friend, do what you came for, not betrayer, not traitor. Friend. It's either the cruelest irony in Scripture or the most devastating grace, maybe both. Judas kisses him. The guard sees him. Peter cuts off someone's ear, finally doing something. Too late, too violent, too useless. Jesus heals the ear, tells Peter to put the sword away. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? 12 legions. 72,000 angels. He had the power. He wasn't using it. And Judas had to watch this, had to see Jesus go willingly, had to realize that everything Jesus had said about dying wasn't metaphor or test or strategy. It was the plan. It had always been the plan. Judas had betrayed him for nothing, or for 30 pieces of silver, or because he'd misunderstood everything from the beginning. The remorse must have been unbearable. Matthew says he went back to the chief priests and said, "I have sinned, for I have betrayed innocent blood." Innocent blood, not the Messiah, not the Son of God. Innocent blood. He'd figured out that Jesus wasn't guilty of the charges, wasn't planning rebellion, wasn't a threat to Rome or the temple system, was just a teacher who'd said uncomfortable things and gathered the wrong kind of attention. And Judas had sold him for the price of a slave. The chief priest's response is perfect in its bureaucratic cruelty. What is that to us? That's your responsibility. You made the deal. You live with it. We got what we wanted. Your guilt is your problem. Judas threw the silver into the temple, the sanctuary itself, not the treasury, hurled it into the holy space where only priests could go, desecrated the place that had paid him to desecrate a man. Then he left and hanged himself. The chief priest picked up the silver and had a meeting about it. Blood money couldn't go into the temple treasury. There were rules about that, procedures, religious laws that mattered even when you just paid to have someone arrested on false charges. So they bought a field with it, the potter's field, a burial place for foreigners. Judas's money, buying graves for outsiders. The irony writes itself. Acts gives a different version. Judas himself bought the field, maybe through an intermediary, maybe with the silver he'd already received. And he died there, his body falling and bursting open. The details don't align, but the trajectory does. Judas betrayed Jesus. Jesus died. Judas couldn't live with it. 3 days later, Jesus was alive again. Judas wasn't. He'd missed the resurrection by 72 hours. This is the part that makes Judas's story unbearable. If he'd waited, if he'd held on, if he'd lived long enough to see what happened next. But he didn't. He died believing he'd destroyed everything. Died believing the movement was finished. Died believing Jesus had been wrong, or weak, or defeated. And he died believing he'd been the instrument of that defeat. 3 days, that's all he needed. The other disciples got to see Jesus alive, got to be forgiven, got to be recommissioned. Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, got to affirm his love 3 times, got to hear, "Feed my sheep," got to become the rock the church was built on. Judas got a rope and a field and a death so ugly that 2 different gospel writers couldn't agree on the details. Theological traditions have not been kind to Judas. Dante put a hymn in the lowest circle of hell, frozen in ice, being chewed eternally in Satan's mouth alongside Brutus and Cassius, the betrayers of Caesar, the worst of the worst. Medieval art depicted him with red hair and a hooked nose, anti-Semitic coding that turned the Jewish disciple into a caricature of Jewish greed. His name became shorthand for traitor, a Judas kiss, a Judas goat, the animal that leads others to slaughter. But here's what's strange. Jesus chose him. Jesus, who knew people's hearts, who saw Nathanael under the fig tree, who told the Samaritan woman everything she'd ever done. Jesus picked Judas to be one of the 12, knowing what he'd do. John's gospel is explicit. Jesus knew from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. From the beginning, he knew, and he chose him anyway. Either this is predestination taken to its cruelest extreme, Judas created to be damned, a prop in the salvation narrative, or it's something more complicated. Maybe Judas had to be there, not because God wanted him to betray Jesus, but because betrayal was inevitable once you involved humans in the story. Someone was going to crack under the pressure. Someone was going to misunderstand. Someone was going to choose self-preservation over faithfulness. It might as well be the one holding the money bag, the one watching the numbers, the one who dealt in concrete realities instead of abstract faith, the one who took Jesus' death predictions seriously and panicked. There's a version of this story where Judas is the only disciple who actually listened. Jesus said he'd be betrayed. Judas believed him. Jesus said he'd die. Judas took him at his word. Jesus said the Son of Man must suffer. Judas saw the must and tried to stop it, or tried to survive it, or tried to force it into making sense, and it broke him. The other disciples got to disbelieve until the resurrection proved them wrong. Judas believed too much, too soon, and couldn't wait for the part where it all made sense. We don't know what Judas thought in those final hours. Whether he died hating Jesus for being weak, or hating himself for being foolish, or hating God for writing a story this cruel. Whether he believed he'd destroyed the Messiah, or just killed a good man. Whether he thought there was any possibility of forgiveness, or whether the weight of what he'd done was simply too much to carry into another sunrise. The field they bought with his silver was called Akeldama, Field of Blood. It's still there, traditionally identified on the southern slope of the Hinnom Valley in Jerusalem. Tourists can visit it. There's a monastery now. The blood has long since soaked into the soil. But the name remains. Judas got a field, a name that means traitor, and 2,000 years of being history's most hated disciple. 30 pieces of silver, half a pound of metal, the price of a slave killed by an ox. Not enough to retire on, barely enough to buy a grave. Judea was Rome's worst posting. Not the most dangerous, not the poorest, but the most annoying. A prefect assigned to Judea knew he'd done something to displease someone important. This wasn't Germania, where you could win glory fighting barbarians. This wasn't Egypt, where you could get rich skimming grain taxes. This wasn't even Syria, where at least the cities were cosmopolitan and the wine was decent. This was Judea, a small, dry, religiously obsessed province that generated barely enough tax revenue to justify the administrative headache and caused more trouble per capita than anywhere else in the empire. Pontius Pilate arrived in 26 CE. He would serve as prefect for 10 years, longer than most, which either meant he was good at his job or nobody wanted to replace him because the posting was that miserable. Probably both. His job description was simple. Keep the peace, collect taxes, don't cause problems that reach Rome. 3 tasks, straightforward in theory, impossible in practice, because Judea was a province that turned everything into a religious crisis. Bring military standards with the emperor's image into Jerusalem. Religious crisis. The standards had to stay in Caesarea, where the prefect actually lived, because images were idolatry, and idolatry made the Jews riot. Use temple funds to build an aqueduct that would give Jerusalem clean water. Religious crisis, the crowd protested. Pilate had soldiers disguised as civilians wade into the mob with clubs. People died. Rome heard about it. Pilate got reprimanded. Hang golden shields in Herod's palace. Shields without images, just inscriptions honoring the emperor. Religious crisis. The Jewish aristocracy sent a delegation to Tiberius himself. The emperor ordered Pilate to remove them. Everything was a crisis. Everything required negotiations with the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, who had their own political factions and their own agendas and their own definitions of what constituted cooperation versus collaboration. Pilate's job was to manage people who hated that he existed while extracting money from them to fund the empire they despised. And he had to do it without sparking a revolt that would require legions to put down, because deploying legions meant admitting you'd lost control, and admitting you'd lost control meant ending your career. Middle management Imperial edition. Every Passover made it worse. Passover celebrated the Exodus, the liberation of the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt, the triumph of their God over an empire. It was a week-long festival of remember that time we escaped foreign oppression, celebrated under Roman occupation. The irony was not subtle. Jerusalem's normal population was maybe 40,000. During Passover, it swelled to over 200,000. Pilgrims from across the empire, from Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, Rome itself, Jewish families fulfilling the commandment to celebrate in the holy city, packed into a space that couldn't hold them, sleeping on rooftops and in courtyards, filling the temple courts, slaughtering lambs by the thousands. The smell alone was unforgettable. Blood and smoke and roasting meat and incense and 200,000 people sweating in the spring heat. The noise, prayers and songs and bleating animals and merchants selling supplies and arguments over space and theology. And underneath it all, the tension, the memory of liberation, the reality of occupation. Pilate came down from Caesarea every Passover, brought extra troops, stationed soldiers on the temple porticos where they could watch the crowds, made sure everyone saw the Roman presence, not to provoke, to remind, to say, we're watching, don't try anything. Most years it worked, mostly. The year Jesus was arrested, Pilate was already dealing with problems. Barabbas was in custody, an insurrectionist, a man who'd committed murder during an uprising, the kind of troublemaker who made Pilate's job harder, charismatic enough to gather followers, violent enough to kill, popular enough that arresting him risked making him a martyr. He was in prison awaiting execution. Then the chief priest showed up at dawn with another prisoner, Jesus of Nazareth, a teacher, a prophet depending on who you asked, a Galilean, which meant he was technically Herod Antipas's problem, but he'd been arrested in Jerusalem, so now he was Pilate's problem. The charges were political. We found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king. 3 accusations, all capital offenses under Roman law: subversion, tax resistance, claiming kingship. Any one of them justified execution. Pilate looked at the prisoner. Jesus didn't look like an insurrectionist, didn't look like Barabbas, no weapons, no bodyguards, no hardness in his eyes. He looked like a teacher who'd had a bad night, bruised from the guards, exhausted, quiet. Pilate asked the obvious question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "You have said so," which wasn't a denial, but it wasn't a claim either. It was the answer of someone who knew the question was a trap. Pilate pressed, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" Jesus said nothing. This was unusual. People accused of capital crimes generally defended themselves, loudly, desperately. They begged, they argued, they called witnesses, they invoked Roman law and Jewish law and anything else that might save their lives. Jesus stood there silently while the chief priest listed his crimes. Pilate found this disturbing. He'd seen guilty men proclaim innocence and innocent men beg for mercy, but he'd rarely seen someone accused of treason just stand there, like he'd already accepted the outcome, like he didn't care, or like he cared about something else more. The chief priests were insistent. He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here. Galilee. Pilate seized on this. Galilee was Herod Antipas's jurisdiction. Herod was in Jerusalem for Passover. This could be his problem instead. Pilate sent Jesus to Herod. This was partially political courtesy, acknowledging Herod's authority, partially buck passing. Let someone else make the decision. Partially strategic. If Herod condemned Jesus, the political fallout landed on him. Herod sent Jesus back. He'd questioned him, mocked him, dressed him in a royal robe as a joke, but he hadn't condemned him, hadn't found him guilty of anything worth executing, which meant the problem was back in Pilate's lap. He called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, made his position clear. You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. No basis for the charges, nothing deserving death. Pilate's verdict, not guilty. The crowd didn't accept this. They wanted blood. Specifically, they wanted Jesus' blood. The chief priests had worked them up, turned this into a public spectacle, made it a test of Pilate's willingness to listen to Jewish concerns. Pilate tried a compromise. There was a custom, historically unverified outside the Gospels, but plausible enough, of releasing a prisoner during Passover, a gesture of goodwill, a way to let the crowd feel like they had some power, while Rome maintained control. Pilate offered them a choice, Jesus or Barabbas. This was strategic. Barabbas was a murderer, an insurrectionist, a man who'd actually committed the crimes Jesus was accused of. The choice should have been obvious. Release the teacher, execute the killer. The crowd chose Barabbas. They wanted Jesus crucified. Pilate asked, why? What crime has he committed? They shouted louder, crucify him. This was becoming a riot. Pilate could see it building, the crowd growing, the noise escalating, the anger spreading. Passover week in Jerusalem, with a mob forming in front of the prefect's residence. This was exactly the scenario he was supposed to prevent. He had options, all of them bad. Option 1, release Jesus, ignore the crowd's demands, assert Roman authority. Consequence, the chief priests report to Rome that Pilate released a man who claimed to be king, which makes Pilate look like he's tolerating treason. The crowd riots anyway because they didn't get what they wanted. Pilate loses credibility with both the Jewish leadership and Rome. Option 2, execute Jesus, give the crowd what they want. Consequence, execute a man he just declared innocent, create a martyr. Possibly spark a different kind of unrest among Jesus' followers, set a precedent that crowds can force his hand. Option 3, do nothing. Let the situation escalate until he's forced to deploy troops. Consequence, people die. Rome hears about it. Pilate gets reprimanded again, possibly recalled. No good options, just degrees of bad. Pilate's wife sent him a message during the trial. Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. This is the only recorded instance of a woman trying to save Jesus. Not Mary Magdalene, not Mary his mother, not any of the female disciples who'd followed him from Galilee. Pilate's wife, a Roman woman, a pagan, someone who didn't know Jesus, didn't follow his teaching, had no stake in his movement. She had a dream, and it frightened her enough to send a message to her husband in the middle of a trial. The Gospels don't record her name. Later tradition calls her Claudia Procula. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church canonized her as a saint, but in the moment, she was just a woman telling her husband, "This is wrong, don't do it." Pilate ignored her, not because he disagreed. He'd already said Jesus was innocent. He knew this was wrong, but he had a job to do, and the job was keeping the peace, and the peace required giving the crowd what they wanted before they became a mob. He called for water, washed his hands in front of the crowd, said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility. Corporate CYA, cover your ass. Document that you oppose this decision. Make sure everyone knows you're executing this man under protest. It wouldn't hold up in any court. I declared him innocent but killed him anyway because people were yelling, isn't a legal defense. But it was a political one. The hand-washing was theater. A public gesture that said, I'm doing this because you're forcing me to. The blame is yours. The crowd accepted the terms. His blood is on us and on our children. This line has caused 2,000 years of horror, used to justify pogroms and persecution, and the claim that Jews were collectively guilty of deicide. But in the moment, it was a mob taking responsibility for a lynching because the Roman prefect had given them the choice and they'd chosen violence. Pilate had Jesus flogged. This was standard procedure before crucifixion, but it was also one more attempt to satisfy the crowd without killing the prisoner. Flogging was brutal. Leather whips embedded with metal or bone, tearing skin and muscle, leaving men barely conscious. Sometimes it was enough. Sometimes the crowd saw the blood and the suffering and decided the prisoner had been punished sufficiently. Pilate brought Jesus out after the flogging, wearing the purple robe the soldiers had put on him, wearing the crown of thorns they'd twisted together. Here is the man, Pilate said. Exe homo. Behold the human. Look at him. Broken, bleeding, humiliated. Is this enough? It wasn't enough. They wanted crucifixion, Pilate argued. You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. The chief priests played their final card. We have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God. Son of God. This was new information, or at least newly emphasized. Pilate went back inside, asked Jesus, "Where do you come from?" Jesus didn't answer. Pilate tried authority. "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." This was not comforting. This was a man saying Pilate's power was temporary, delegated, subordinate to something higher, and that someone else, the chief priest Judas, the system itself, bore more guilt than Pilate did. True, maybe, but not helpful. Pilate tried once more to release him. The chief priests made their final threat. "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." Friend of Caesar. Amicus Caesaris. This was a technical term, a political designation. Being a friend of Caesar meant you had the emperor's favor and protection. Losing it meant losing everything. The chief priests were threatening to report Pilate to Tiberius for releasing a traitor. They were saying, "Execute this man, or we'll tell Rome you're soft on insurrection." Pilate brought Jesus out one last time, sat down on the judge's seat at the place called the Stone Pavement. It was the 6th hour, noon, the day of preparation, the day before Passover. He said to the Jews, "Here is your king." They shouted, "Take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. The chief priest answered, "We have no king but Caesar." This was the moment. The chief priests, the religious leaders of a nation that believed God was their only king, declared that Caesar was their king. They chose Rome over their own theology to get Jesus executed. Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified. He had a sign made and fastened to the cross. "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews," written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, the 3 languages of the empire, a public declaration visible to everyone. The chief priests objected. "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be King of the Jews." Pilate refused to change it. "What I have written, I have written." This was his last act of resistance. He'd executed the man, but he'd done it on his terms. The sign said what Pilate wanted it to say, a small victory, petty even. But it was all he had. Jesus died that afternoon. Pilate's role in the story ended there. He granted Joseph of Arimathea permission to take the body for burial. He posted guards at the tomb when the chief priests worried about the disciples stealing the body. Then he disappears from the gospel narratives. History records a little more. Pilate remained prefect of Judea until 36 CE. He was recalled to Rome after an incident in Samaria. He'd attacked a group of Samaritans gathering on Mount Gerizim, killing many. The Samaritans complained to Pilate's superior, the legate of Syria, who sent Pilate back to Rome to answer for excessive force. By the time Pilate reached Rome, Tiberius was dead. We don't know what happened to him after that. He vanishes from historical record. Later legends say he committed suicide, that he was exiled to Gaul and drowned himself in the Rhone, that his body was thrown into the Tiber, but the water rejected it, and it was carried from river to river until it ended up in a mountain lake near Lucerne, where it still haunts the waters. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church canonized him as a saint, along with his wife, believing he converted to Christianity. The Coptic Church commemorates him as a martyr. Western tradition made him a villain, a coward, the man who washed his hands while killing God. The Apostles' Creed mentions him by name, suffered under Pontius Pilate. He's one of the few historical figures named in the Creed. Not Augustus, not Herod, not Caiaphas. Pilate. The man who tried to avoid making a decision and ended up making the most consequential one in Christian history. He was a mid-level Roman bureaucrat trying to manage an impossible province during a religious festival that celebrated liberation from empire. He examined Jesus and found him innocent. He tried to release him. He failed. And 2,000 years later, his name is recited in churches every Sunday as the man under whom Christ suffered. Not the man who condemned Christ, under whom. The phrasing is almost passive, as if Pilate were a circumstance rather than an actor, a condition of the time rather than a person making choices, which might be the most accurate description. Pilate didn't want Jesus dead. He wanted stability. He wanted the crowd to disperse. He wanted Passover to end without incident so he could return to Caesarea and file a report that said everything went smoothly. He wanted to keep his job. The system he served required Jesus' death. The crowd demanded it. The chief priests orchestrated it. Rome's authority depended on it. Pilate just signed the paperwork, washed his hands, and spent the rest of history trying to get the blood off. The high priest's residence sat on the western hill of Jerusalem, overlooking the Temple Mount. Stone walls, courtyards, servants' quarters, administrative offices where scribes kept records of temple finances, priestly schedules, sacrificial rosters, festival preparations. This wasn't just a home. It was the operational headquarters of the largest religious institution in Judaism, the nerve center of a system that employed thousands and processed millions of denarii annually. Joseph Caiaphas had held the office of high priest for 18 years. 18 years. This was extraordinary. High priests usually lasted a few years before Roman authorities replaced them or internal politics forced them out. The position was supposed to be hereditary and lifelong, but Rome had turned it into a political appointment. Prefects installed high priests who cooperated and removed ones who didn't. Caiaphas had survived 3 Roman prefects. Valerius Gratus appointed him in 18 CE. Pontius Pilate kept him. Marcellus would eventually remove him in 36 CE, the same year Pilate was recalled. 18 years meant Caiaphas was good at his job, and his job was impossible. He had to maintain Jewish religious law while collaborating with a pagan empire. He had to preserve temple sanctity while answering to Roman prefects who didn't care about purity codes. He had to keep the priesthood functioning while navigating the political factions that wanted him gone. Pharisees who thought he was too compromised. Sadducees who thought he wasn't pragmatic enough. Zealots who thought anyone cooperating with Rome deserved death. He had to be Jewish enough to maintain legitimacy and Roman enough to keep his position. The tension was constant. The stakes were existential. Because if Caiaphas failed, if he lost control, if the temple became a center of resistance, if Rome decided the Jewish religious establishment was more trouble than it was worth, Rome would do what Rome always did: destroy it. The temple wasn't just a building. It was the economic engine of Jerusalem. Pilgrims came 3 times a year for the major festivals: Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles. Hundreds of thousands of them. They needed places to stay, food to eat, animals to sacrifice, money exchanged from foreign currency into temple coinage. The temple employed priests, thousands of them, organized into 24 divisions that rotated service. Each division served 2 weeks per year plus the major festivals. They received portions of the sacrifices as payment. Their families depended on this income. The temple employed Levites, singers, musicians, gatekeepers, maintenance workers, guards. The temple employed scribes, accountants, architects, craftsmen, merchants authorized to sell in the temple courts. The temple supported the local economy. Vendors who sold sacrificial animals, farmers who raised unblemished lambs, bakers who made showbread, weavers who made priestly garments, metal workers who crafted temple implements. Remove the temple and you collapse the economy of Jerusalem. Caiaphas knew this. He also knew what happened when provinces rebelled. Rome didn't negotiate. Rome didn't compromise. Rome sent legions, and when legions arrived, people died, cities burned, populations were enslaved or scattered. The survivors paid higher taxes to fund the cost of their own suppression. Caiaphas had seen it happen elsewhere. Every educated Jew knew the stories. When Judea had tried rebellion before, Rome had crucified thousands, lined the roads with crosses, left the bodies hanging as warnings. The high priest's job was to prevent that, to keep the peace, to maintain enough cooperation with Rome that Rome didn't feel threatened, to preserve Jewish identity and practice within the constraints of occupation, to choose survival, even when survival required compromise, even when compromise felt like betrayal. Jesus of Nazareth was becoming a problem. Not at first. At first, he was just another prophet. Galilee produced them regularly. Charismatic teachers who gathered followers, preached repentance, promised that God would intervene. Most faded after a few months. Some got arrested, a few got executed. None of them fundamentally threatened the system. Jesus was different. He'd been active for 3 years. His movement was growing. He performed healings that people swore were miracles. He taught with an authority that unsettled the scribes, not citing previous rabbis, not building arguments through traditional interpretation, just speaking as if he had direct access to divine truth. He criticized the Pharisees publicly, called them hypocrites, blind guides, whitewashed tombs. This was dangerous but manageable. The Pharisees weren't in power, and internal Jewish religious debates didn't concern Rome. But then Jesus started talking about the temple. He'd caused a disturbance in the temple courts during a previous Passover, overturned the tables of the money changers, drove out the merchants selling sacrificial animals, quoted scripture about God's house being a house of prayer while calling them a den of robbers. This was more than religious criticism. This was attacking the economic system. The money changers and merchants operated with temple authorization. They provided necessary services. Pilgrims needed to exchange currency, needed to buy unblemished animals for sacrifice. The system had problems, yes. The exchange rates were exploitative. The prices were inflated. The whole operation generated revenue that enriched the priestly families. But it functioned. It kept the temple running. It employed people. It allowed Jews across the empire to fulfill their religious obligations. Jesus called it robbery, and people listened. Then the reports started coming in about his teaching. He'd said something about destroying the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days. The accounts were confused. Some said he'd threatened to destroy it. Others said he'd predicted its destruction. Others said he was speaking metaphorically about something else entirely. But the phrase, "destroy the temple," was enough. Rome had destroyed temples before. Jerusalem's own temple had been destroyed by Babylon 6 centuries earlier. Every Jew knew the stories, knew the Psalms of exile, knew what happened when the central institution of Jewish life was torn down. And here was a prophet talking about it happening again. The Sanhedrin started paying attention. The Sanhedrin was the Jewish ruling council. 71 members, chief priests, elders, scribes, teachers of the law. They handled religious legal matters, settled disputes, maintained order within the Jewish community. They met in the chamber of hewn stone on the Temple Mount. Caiaphas presided. The council was divided. It always was. Sadducees and Pharisees disagreed on fundamental theology, resurrection, angels, oral law, how to interpret scripture, how to relate to Roman power. They agreed on almost nothing, but they were starting to agree that Jesus was a problem, not because of his theology. His debates with Pharisees about Sabbath observance and ritual purity were internal Jewish matters. His teachings about the kingdom of God could be interpreted as spiritual rather than political, but his popularity was growing. The crowds following him were getting larger, and crowds made Rome nervous, especially during Passover. Caiaphas had lived through enough Passovers to know the pattern. The city swelled with pilgrims. The atmosphere became charged. All those people celebrating liberation from Egypt while living under Rome, singing psalms about God defeating Israel's enemies, while Roman soldiers watched from the fortress Antonia, overlooking the temple courts. Every Passover was a potential powder keg. One spark could ignite it. One charismatic leader claiming divine authority could turn a religious festival into a riot. A riot could turn into a rebellion. A rebellion would bring legions, and legions would destroy Jerusalem. Caiaphas called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. The question was straightforward. What do we do about Jesus of Nazareth? The council debated. Some wanted to arrest him immediately. Some wanted to wait until after Passover when the crowds had dispersed. Some wanted to engage him in public debate, expose the weaknesses in his teaching, discredit him before his followers. Some pointed out that he hadn't actually broken Jewish law. His Sabbath interpretations were unconventional but not heretical. His claims about himself were ambiguous. He spoke in parables, used metaphors, rarely made direct statements that could be prosecuted. Some argued that arresting him without clear cause would make him a martyr, that his followers would see persecution as proof that he was a true prophet. The debate went in circles. Then Caiaphas spoke. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. One man, one life, weighed against the survival of the nation. This wasn't cruelty. This was mathematics, utilitarian ethics. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. Jesus was one man. Jerusalem held hundreds of thousands. The Jewish population across the empire numbered in the millions. If Jesus' movement provoked Rome into destroying Jerusalem, how many would die? How many families would be torn apart? How many children would be enslaved? The temple would burn. The priesthood would end. The sacrificial system would collapse. Jewish identity, already fragmented by diaspora, already strained by occupation, might not survive. One man's death could prevent all of that. If Jesus died, his movement would likely collapse. Followers would scatter. The threat would dissipate. Passover would proceed without incident. Rome would have no reason to intervene. The nation would survive. Caiaphas wasn't wrong about the stakes. He was wrong about the outcome. But he couldn't have known that. The plan was to arrest Jesus quietly. After Passover, when the crowds had dispersed, avoid making a public spectacle. Handle it internally through the Sanhedrin. Then present Rome with a fait accompli. But then Judas Iscariot showed up, one of Jesus' own disciples, offering to hand him over, offering to identify him away from the crowds in a place where an arrest wouldn't spark a riot. The opportunity was too perfect. The chief priest paid Judas, not much, 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave, an amount small enough to be insulting. But Judas took it, and that night he led the temple guards to Gethsemane. The arrest went smoothly. No riot, no resistance. Jesus' disciples scattered. One of them, Peter, drew a sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. But Jesus told him to put it away, healed the servant's ear, according to some accounts. They brought Jesus to Caiaphas' residence. It was night, after midnight. Members of the Sanhedrin had been summoned. Not the full council, not a formal trial, but enough witnesses to establish what Jesus had said and done. The proceedings were irregular. Jewish law required trials to be held during daylight, required a full quorum, required witnesses to agree on specifics, required a waiting period between conviction and execution. None of this happened, because this wasn't really a trial. It was an interrogation, a fact-finding session to determine what charges would hold up before Pilate, because Caiaphas couldn't execute Jesus himself. Rome had removed the Sanhedrin's authority to carry out capital punishment decades earlier. The council could investigate, could judge, could condemn, but only Rome could execute, which meant Jesus had to be guilty of something Rome cared about. Blasphemy wouldn't work. Rome didn't care about Jewish religious law. A man claiming to be the Messiah was a Jewish theological problem, not a Roman political one. But a man claiming to be a king, that was treason. The witnesses testified. They reported Jesus' statement about destroying the temple. Their accounts didn't quite match. Some said he'd threatened to destroy it. Others said he'd predicted its destruction. Others said he'd claimed he would rebuild it in 3 days. The testimony was confused enough to be legally problematic. Caiaphas questioned Jesus directly. Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? Jesus said nothing. Caiaphas pressed harder. I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. This was the question that mattered. Not about the temple, not about his teaching, about his identity. Jesus answered, You have said so. But I say to all of you, From now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. This was a claim, not explicit, not yes, I am the Messiah, but close enough. The phrase Son of Man came from Daniel, a vision of a divine figure coming on the clouds, receiving authority and glory and sovereign power. The phrase sitting at the right hand came from Psalm 110, the Lord saying to David's Lord, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." Jesus was claiming divine authority, claiming a position at God's right hand, claiming that those who judged him would see him vindicated. Caiaphas tore his clothes. This was the prescribed response to blasphemy. The high priest, hearing blasphemy, was required to tear his garments as a visible sign of horror and grief. He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? The council answered, "He is worthy of death." They had their religious verdict. Now they needed a political one. They took Jesus to Pilate at dawn, presented him as a political threat, a man claiming to be king, opposing Roman taxes, subverting the nation. Pilate examined him, found no basis for the charges, tried to release him. The chief priests pushed harder, gathered a crowd, turned the trial into a public spectacle, made it a test of Pilate's loyalty to Caesar. Pilate tried to pass the decision to Herod. Herod sent Jesus back. Pilate offered to release either Jesus or Barabbas. The crowd chose Barabbas. Pilate declared Jesus innocent. The crowd demanded crucifixion, and Caiaphas had what he needed. Roman execution, Roman responsibility, Roman soldiers driving the nails. The high priest's hands were technically clean. He'd identified a threat to national survival. He'd brought that threat to the proper authorities. He'd allowed Rome to make the final decision. He'd chosen the many over the one. Jesus died that afternoon. Caiaphas probably thought the problem was solved. The movement would collapse. The followers would scatter. Passover would end peacefully. Jerusalem would survive another year. He was right about Passover. It ended without incident. He was wrong about everything else. The movement didn't collapse. 3 days later, the disciples were claiming Jesus had risen from the dead. Within weeks, they were preaching publicly in the temple courts. Within months, thousands had joined them. Caiaphas arrested Peter and John, brought them before the Sanhedrin, ordered them to stop speaking in Jesus' name. They refused. The movement kept growing. Caiaphas tried suppression, didn't work. Tried accommodation, didn't work. Tried ignoring them, definitely didn't work. Christianity spread across the empire. And 40 years later, in 70 CE, Rome destroyed Jerusalem anyway, not because of Jesus' movement, because of a different rebellion. Zealots who'd had enough of Roman occupation, who'd killed the Roman garrison, who'd declared independence. Rome sent legions, 4 of them, under the command of Vespasian and his son Titus. The siege lasted 5 months. Starvation killed thousands. When the legions finally breached the walls, they slaughtered the survivors, burned the temple, tore it down stone by stone looking for melted gold. The priesthood ended. The sacrificial system ended. The Sanhedrin dissolved. Everything Caiaphas had tried to preserve was destroyed, not because he executed Jesus, because the fundamental problem, occupation, oppression, the impossibility of maintaining Jewish identity under Roman rule, couldn't be managed away. The system was always going to collapse. Caiaphas had just delayed it by 40 years. We don't know what happened to him. He was removed from office in 36 CE, the same year Pilate was recalled. He disappears from historical record after that. Some traditions say he converted to Christianity. This is almost certainly false. Early Christian writers who loved conversion stories would have mentioned it. More likely, he lived out his remaining years in obscurity, watching the movement he'd tried to suppress grow into a religion, watching the temple he'd tried to protect become the center of increasing conflict with Rome, watching his utilitarian calculation proven both right and wrong. Right that Jesus' movement was a threat, wrong that killing Jesus would eliminate it, right that Rome would destroy Jerusalem if provoked, wrong that collaboration and compromise could prevent it. The high priest who chose survival over principle discovered that survival was never really an option, just different timelines for the same inevitable end. History remembers Caiaphas as a villain, the man who orchestrated Jesus' execution, the religious leader who chose political expedience over truth. But he was doing what religious leaders have always done when their institutions are threatened: calculating, compromising, choosing the path that seems most likely to preserve what they're responsible for protecting. Every denomination that softened its stance to maintain social relevance, every church that stayed silent during injustice to avoid losing members or funding, every religious institution that's collaborated with power to survive, they're all making Caiaphas's calculation. One principle sacrificed for institutional survival, one truth compromised to preserve the larger mission, one person harmed to protect the many. The math always makes sense in the moment. The high priest looking at the carpenter from Nazareth and seeing an existential threat to everything he'd spent 18 years protecting: the nation, the temple, the priesthood, the people, all of it hanging in the balance, all of it weighing against one man's life. The equation seemed simple. It wasn't wrong exactly, just incomplete, because Caiaphas was calculating survival in political terms: Roman legions, Jewish populations, institutional continuity. He wasn't calculating what survives beyond institutions. The temple burned, the priesthood ended, the Sanhedrin dissolved, but the movement Caiaphas tried to eliminate by executing its founder became the largest religion in human history, not because of institutional power, because of the story of a high priest choosing expediency, a governor washing his hands, a crowd demanding blood, a man dying on a cross, and somehow, impossibly, that death not ending the movement, but launching it. Caiaphas chose the many over the one. The one outlasted the many. The high priest's name is remembered primarily in the context of the man he condemned. The temple he tried to save is gone. The calculation he made, so rational, so pragmatic, so tragically inevitable, echoes through every religious institution that's ever faced the same impossible choice: preserve the structure or protect the truth, maintain the institution or follow the principle, choose survival or risk everything. Most choose survival. Caiaphas did. And 2,000 years later, we're still watching religious leaders make the same calculation, reach the same conclusion, discover the same bitter truth: that institutions built on compromise eventually collapse anyway. But stories, even stories about carpenters executed for threatening the system, those endure long after the temple stones have scattered. We've spent hours now making villains human, and you might be uncomfortable. That's the point. Because if Pharaoh had economic reasons, if Jezebel had cultural justifications, if Herod had political pressures, if Judas had practical concerns, if Pilate had institutional constraints, if Caiaphas had utilitarian logic, then what separates them from us? What separates their compromises from ours? Their calculations from the ones we make every day? The answer is, not much. And that's terrifying, because we need villains to be obvious. We need evil to announce itself, to wear black hats, to cackle maniacally, to be so clearly wrong that we'd recognize it instantly and resist it heroically. We need the story to be simple. Good people versus bad people, light versus darkness, heroes versus villains, clean lines, clear sides, obvious choices. But history doesn't work that way. History is messy, complicated, full of people making rational decisions within irrational systems, full of choices that made sense at the time and look monstrous in hindsight, full of ordinary people doing terrible things for comprehensible reasons. And that's the problem with humanizing biblical villains. Because once you understand why they did it, you have to confront the uncomfortable question: what would I have done? You're Pharaoh. Your economy runs on slave labor. Your advisors are telling you that emancipation means economic collapse. Your priests are telling you that the plagues are temporary. The Nile will recover, the frogs will die off, the locusts will move on. Every time you consider letting the Hebrews go, someone presents you with a report showing the catastrophic GDP impact. Do you choose economic suicide? Or do you harden your heart and wait for the crisis to pass? You're Jezebel. You're a foreign princess married off to secure a political alliance. Your marriage contract probably required you to maintain your religious traditions. That's how these arrangements worked. You built temples to your gods because that was the deal. Now you're being vilified for not converting to your husband's religion, even though male kings kept foreign wives and foreign temples constantly without becoming shorthand for evil. Do you abandon your identity to appease people who hate you anyway? Or do you maintain your dignity and accept the villain edit? You're Herod. You've built the most magnificent temple in Jewish history. You've created an economic boom. You've maintained stability in a region famous for rebellion. You've also killed people, lots of people, because paranoia is rational when everyone actually is plotting against you. Now, there are reports of a baby born in Bethlehem who's supposedly destined to replace you. Do you ignore the threat and hope it's nothing? Or do you eliminate it and accept the blood on your hands? You're Judas. You've been following Jesus for 3 years. You've seen the miracles. You've heard the teachings. You've also been managing the finances, and you've watched the money run out. You've listened to Jesus talk about dying, about being betrayed, about the Son of Man being lifted up. You think maybe he needs a push. Maybe he's waiting for the right moment. Maybe if you force his hand, he'll finally use his power and start the revolution everyone's expecting. Do you trust the process and watch it collapse? Or do you take action and hope you're helping? You're Pilate. You're a Roman governor in a province nobody wants. Your job is to keep the peace and collect taxes. Every Passover is a security nightmare. Now the Jewish religious leaders have brought you a man they want executed. He doesn't seem dangerous. He seems confused, maybe delusional, possibly innocent. But the crowd is getting agitated. The chief priests are making it a loyalty test. If you let him go and there's a riot, Rome will hear about it. If you execute him and he's innocent, well, he's one man and you've executed hundreds. Do you risk your career for a stranger? Or do you wash your hands and sign the order? You're Caiaphas. You've been high priest for 18 years. You've kept the temple functioning under Roman occupation. You've maintained Jewish identity while collaborating with an empire. You've navigated impossible politics and kept your people alive. Now there's a prophet whose movement is growing, whose rhetoric is inflammatory, whose presence during Passover could spark a riot that brings Roman legions. You do the math. One man's life versus the survival of the nation. Do you let the crisis escalate and hope Rome shows mercy? Or do you eliminate the threat and carry the guilt? These aren't easy questions. They're not supposed to be. Because the thing about villains is that they're never villains in their own stories. In their own stories, they're the protagonists, the heroes, the people making hard choices in impossible situations. Pharaoh is protecting Egyptian prosperity. Jezebel is maintaining her cultural identity. Herod is securing his kingdom. Judas is trying to force Jesus' hand. Pilate is keeping the peace. Caiaphas is saving the nation. They all have reasons. They all have justifications. They all think they're doing the right thing, or at least the necessary thing, or at minimum, the least bad thing available. And that's what makes them terrifying. Not that they're monsters, that they're human. Not that they're incomprehensible, that they're perfectly comprehensible. Not that we'd never make their choices, that we probably would. Given the same pressures, the same systems, the same incentives, the same information, the same 24 hours to decide, we like to think we'd be different. We like to think we'd recognize evil and resist it, that we'd choose principle over expedience, that we'd sacrifice our careers, our security, our institutions, our nations, rather than compromise. We like to think we're heroes. But history suggests otherwise. History suggests that most people, most of the time, make the practical choice, the safe choice, the choice that preserves their position and protects their interests. History suggests that systems are very good at making the wrong choice feel like the only choice. And that's the real villain, not Pharaoh, the economic system that made slavery profitable, not Jezebel, the patriarchal system that vilified powerful women, not Herod, the imperial system that rewarded paranoid violence, not Judas, the revolutionary expectations that demanded a political messiah, not Pilate, the colonial system that prioritized stability over justice, not Caiaphas, the religious system that equated institutional survival with faithfulness. The system, always the system, the structures that reward certain behaviors and punish others, the incentives that make cruelty rational and compassion costly, the institutions that turn ordinary people into perpetrators. Because here's the thing about systems, they're diffuse. You can't crucify a system. You can't point to it and say, there's the villain. You can't arrest it, try it, execute it, and feel like justice has been served. Systems are made of thousands of people making small compromises, millions of decisions that seem reasonable in isolation but create horror in aggregate. The bureaucrat processing paperwork, the soldier following orders, the priest maintaining tradition, the politician calculating votes, the accountant balancing budgets, the middle manager avoiding conflict. None of them think they're doing evil. Most of them think they're doing their jobs. And that's how systems perpetuate themselves. Not through obvious villains making obviously villainous choices, through ordinary people making ordinary compromises within structures that normalize the abnormal. The Roman soldier who nails Jesus to the cross isn't a monster. He's a working-class guy doing his assigned task. He's hammered nails through flesh before. He'll do it again tomorrow. It's just his job. The temple guard who arrests Jesus in Gethsemane isn't evil. He's following orders from the high priest. This is what he's paid to do. He goes home that night and eats dinner with his family. The crowd that demands crucifixion isn't a mob of sadists. They're people who've been told this man is a threat. They're repeating what the authorities said. They're going along with the group. They're doing what crowds do. None of them are villains. All of them participate in killing an innocent man because the system told them to. And systems are very good at making their logic seem inevitable. Pharaoh's advisors present economic data showing that emancipation would collapse the kingdom. The numbers are real. The projections are accurate. The conclusion seems inescapable. We can't afford to let them go. The system has spoken. Herod's security apparatus reports credible threats to his throne. The intelligence is reliable. The pattern is established. Royal rivals get eliminated. The conclusion seems obvious. Neutralize the threat. The system has spoken. Caiaphas's council calculates the risk of Roman intervention. The historical precedent is clear. The utilitarian math is simple. The conclusion seems rational. One death prevents many. The system has spoken. And when the system speaks, people listen. Not because they're evil, because they're embedded, because their livelihoods depend on the system, because their identities are wrapped up in it, because questioning the system means questioning everything they've built their lives around, because the system rewards compliance and punishes dissent. You question Pharaoh's economic policy. You're threatening Egyptian prosperity. You're unpatriotic. You're naive about how economies work. You question Herod's security measures. You're soft on threats. You're endangering the kingdom. You're complicit in future attacks. You question Caiaphas's utilitarian calculation. You're risking the whole nation. You're prioritizing one person over millions. You're irresponsible. The system has answers for every objection. The system always has answers. And the people operating within the system, Pharaoh, Jezebel, Herod, Judas, Pilate, Caiaphas, they're not villains who reject the system. They're products of it. They're people who've internalized its logic, accepted its premises, learned to navigate its incentives. They're successful because they're good at working within the system. And that's exactly what makes them dangerous. Because if evil required villains, obvious monsters making obviously monstrous choices, we could identify it and resist it. But if evil is systemic, woven into the structures we operate within, the incentives we respond to, the calculations we make, then we're all implicated. We're all Pharaoh when we benefit from economic systems built on exploitation and tell ourselves we can't afford to change them. We're all Jezebel when we're vilified for not conforming to expectations we never agreed to. We're all Herod when we prioritize security over mercy and call it prudence. We're all Judas when we think we're helping by forcing outcomes we don't control. We're all Pilate when we wash our hands and let injustice proceed because intervention is costly. We're all Caiaphas when we sacrifice principles to preserve institutions. We're all participants in systems that normalize harm. And that's the discomfort of humanizing villains. Because once you understand their reasons, you lose the comfort of distance. You can't say, "I'd never do that," because you already are doing that. Just in smaller ways, in different contexts, within different systems. You're making the same calculations, the same compromises, the same choices that prioritize comfort over conscience. You're buying products made by exploited labor because they're cheaper and you can't afford the alternative. You're staying silent about injustices because speaking up would cost you professionally. You're going along with institutional policies you disagree with because you need the job. You're not a villain. You're just operating within a system, and the system rewards your compliance. This is why we flatten biblical villains into cartoons, because cartoons are safe. Cartoons are obviously evil. Cartoons make choices we'd never make. Cartoons exist in a different moral universe. If Pharaoh is just a stubborn tyrant who hates Hebrews for no reason, we don't have to think about economic systems built on exploitation. If Jezebel is just a wicked seductress who corrupts good men, we don't have to think about how we vilify women who refuse to conform. If Herod is just a paranoid monster who kills babies, we don't have to think about how security logic justifies violence. If Judas is just a greedy betrayer who sold out for silver. We don't have to think about how desperation drives people to desperate choices. If Pilate is just a coward who wouldn't stand up for truth, we don't have to think about how institutions punish people who resist them. If Caiaphas is just a corrupt priest who killed the Messiah, we don't have to think about how religious leaders compromise to survive. We get to be the good guys. We get to imagine we'd resist. We'd be different. We'd recognize evil and oppose it. We get to sleep soundly, confident in our moral superiority. But humanizing them ruins that comfort. Because if they had reasons, comprehensible, rational, system-endorsed reasons, then we have to ask, what are our reasons? What systems are we embedded in? What compromises are we making? What harm are we normalizing? What future generation will look back at us and ask, how did they not see it? How did they participate? How did they think they were the good guys? Because they will ask that. Every generation does. We look back at slavery and ask how anyone justified it. They had reasons, economic reasons, biblical reasons, scientific reasons. The system endorsed it. We look back at colonialism and ask how anyone participated. They had reasons, civilizing missions, economic development, strategic interests. The system endorsed it. We look back at the Holocaust and ask how ordinary Germans became complicit. They had reasons, economic anxiety, national pride, following orders. The system endorsed it. We look back at segregation and ask how Christians defended it. They had reasons, biblical interpretation, social stability, property values. The system endorsed it. We look back and we judge. We say, we'd never do that. We'd resist. We'd be different. And then we make our own compromises within our own systems and tell ourselves it's different this time. It's never different. The pattern is always the same. Ordinary people, embedded in systems, making rational choices, participating in harm, convinced they're doing the right thing, or at least the necessary thing, or at minimum, the only realistic thing. The villain is the system, but we'd rather blame individuals, because individuals can be condemned, removed, replaced. We can point at Pharaoh and say he's the problem. We can point at Caiaphas and say he's the villain. We can execute them and feel like justice has been served. But the system continues. New pharaohs, new Caiaphases, new people making the same calculations within the same structures. The incentives haven't changed. The logic hasn't changed. The rewards for compliance and punishments for dissent haven't changed. Only the names have changed. And that's the gentle cynic's observation after watching this pattern repeat for centuries. The real villain is usually the system. But we'd rather blame individuals because systems are harder to crucify. You can nail a person to a cross. You can watch them die. You can feel like the problem is solved. You can't crucify an economic system. You can't execute an imperial structure. You can't kill an institution. You can only dismantle it, piece by piece, incentive by incentive, compromise by compromise. And that's exhausting. That's costly. That requires sustained resistance over years or decades or generations. It's so much easier to find a villain, someone to blame, someone to hate, someone whose death or removal will fix everything. The biblical villains we've examined tonight, they were all convenient scapegoats. Pharaoh gets blamed for the Exodus, but the Egyptian economic system that made slavery profitable outlasted him by centuries. Jezebel gets blamed for Israel's apostasy, but the syncretism she represented was endemic to the region and continued long after her death. Herod gets blamed for the Bethlehem massacre, but the paranoid violence required to maintain puppet kingship under Rome continued through his sons. Judas gets blamed for Jesus' death, But the revolutionary expectations that drove his choice continued to fuel Jewish resistance movements for decades. Pilate gets blamed for the crucifixion, but the Roman colonial system that made crucifixion routine continued for centuries. Caiaphas gets blamed for condemning Jesus, but the impossible position of maintaining Jewish identity under occupation continued until Rome destroyed the temple. The individuals died, the systems endured, and new individuals stepped into the same roles, faced the same pressures, made the same choices, because that's what systems do. They perpetuate themselves. They reproduce their logic. They create conditions where the wrong choice feels like the only choice. And they do it so effectively that the people operating within them genuinely believe they're doing the right thing. Pharaoh believed he was protecting Egypt. Jezebel believed she was maintaining her dignity. Herod believed he was securing his kingdom. Judas believed he was helping Jesus. Pilate believed he was keeping the peace. Caiaphas believed he was saving the nation. They weren't lying. They weren't pretending. They weren't twirling mustaches and cackling about how evil they were. They believed it, just like we believe our own justifications for the compromises we make. Just like future generations will look at our justifications and wonder how we believed them. The cycle continues because we keep looking for villains instead of examining systems. We keep personalizing evil instead of recognizing its structural nature. We keep thinking that if we just remove the bad people, everything will be fine. And it never is, because the bad people weren't the problem. The system that made their choices rational was the problem. The incentives that rewarded their compromises were the problem. The structures that normalized their harm were the problem. And those don't die when individuals die. Those persist. Those adapt. Those find new people to operate them. The temple that Caiaphas tried to protect by executing Jesus was destroyed 40 years later. Not because Caiaphas was a villain, because the fundamental tension between Jewish identity and Roman occupation couldn't be managed away. The system collapsed, as systems eventually do, but not before generations of people operated within it, making their calculations, carrying their guilt, convinced they were choosing the lesser evil. Not before thousands of individual choices, each one rational, each one defensible, each one contributing to the inevitable catastrophe, accumulated into tragedy. That's how systems work. They distribute responsibility so widely that no one feels fully accountable. They normalize harm so gradually that people stop noticing it. They reward compliance so consistently that resistance seems irrational. And they convince participants that they're not villains, just people doing their jobs, just people making hard choices, just people trying to survive. Which is true, and also insufficient, because survival within an unjust system means perpetuating that system. Compliance with structural evil means becoming complicit in it. Making rational choices within irrational structures means participating in irrationality. And calling yourself a good person while doing it means missing the point entirely. The biblical villains we've examined weren't good people making good choices, but they also weren't monsters making monstrous choices. They were embedded people making embedded choices, system people making system choices. And the tragedy isn't that they were uniquely evil. The tragedy is that they were ordinarily human, that given their positions, their pressures, their information, their incentives, most of us would have made the same choices, that we are making the same choices, just in different contexts, within different systems, with different justifications, but the same essential pattern, prioritizing what the system rewards over what conscience requires. And that's the real discomfort of tonight's examination. Not that biblical villains were human, that we're not different, that the line between hero and villain isn't as clear as we'd like, that evil doesn't announce itself with horns and a pitchfork, that it shows up wearing business casual and carrying a cost-benefit analysis, that it speaks the language of necessity, pragmatism, realism, that it convinces us we're doing the right thing even as we participate in harm, that it's systemic, structural, normal, that it's us, not because we're monsters, because we're human, operating within systems that make monstrous choices seem reasonable. The biblical text preserves these villains not as cautionary tales about obvious evil, but as mirrors reflecting uncomfortable truths about power, complicity, and the human capacity for rationalized harm. Pharaoh's hardened heart shows us how economic incentives can override moral clarity. Jezebel's vilification shows us how powerful women get written into history by people who feared them. Herod's paranoia shows us how security logic justifies violence. Judas's betrayal shows us how desperation drives people to force outcomes they can't control. Pilate's hand-washing shows us how institutions protect themselves by diffusing responsibility. Caiaphas's calculation shows us how religious leaders compromise principles to preserve institutions. These aren't just ancient stories about bad people. They're ongoing stories about how systems shape choices, how power corrupts not by making people evil, but by making evil seem reasonable, how ordinary people participate in extraordinary harm, how we're all capable of becoming villains in someone else's story while remaining heroes in our own. And the text preserves them because every generation needs to confront this reality, needs to ask, what systems am I embedded in? What compromises am I making? What harm am I normalizing? Needs to recognize that the villain is rarely the person, usually the system. But systems are made of people making choices, small choices, daily choices, choices that seem insignificant in isolation, but accumulate into structures of harm. And those structures endure long after the individuals are gone. The Egyptian economic system that enslaved the Hebrews outlasted Pharaoh. The gender politics that vilified Jezebel outlasted her. The imperial violence that Herod employed outlasted him. The revolutionary expectations that drove Judas outlasted his suicide. The colonial apparatus that Pilate represented outlasted his recall. The religious compromise that Caiaphas embodied outlasted the temple itself. The systems endured, adapting, evolving, finding new people to operate them, new justifications, new crises, new calculations, the same essential pattern in different forms. And we inherit those systems. We operate within them. We benefit from them. We perpetuate them, often without even noticing, because that's what it means to be embedded, to see the system's logic as natural, inevitable, just the way things are, to make its calculations automatically, without questioning the premises, to participate in its harm while believing we're good people making reasonable choices, until someone from outside the system points it out, until a prophet shows up and says, "Let my people go," until someone overturns the tables and calls the whole operation robbery, until the system's victims speak up and refuse to be silent anymore. And then we have a choice, not an easy choice, not a costless choice. The choice Pharaoh faced: change the system and lose everything, or preserve it and harden your heart. The choice Caiaphas faced: protect the institution or follow the prophet, knowing you can't do both. The choice every system-embedded person faces when confronted with its injustice: comply or resist, knowing both have consequences. Most people choose compliance, not because they're villains, because they're human, because resistance is costly, because the system punishes it, because individual action feels futile against structural power, because it's easier to wash your hands and say, "I'm just doing my job," easier to make the calculation and say, "I'm protecting the greater good," easier to harden your heart and say, "I can't afford to change," easier to participate and tell yourself you're not really responsible. The biblical villains made those choices. We make those choices, and the cycle continues, generation after generation, system after system, until enough people choose differently, until enough people recognize that the villain isn't just the person, it's the system, and systems only change when people refuse to operate them. When enough pharaohs let the people go, when enough Pilates refuse to sign the execution order, when enough Caiaphases choose the one over the many, when enough ordinary people make extraordinary choices to resist rather than comply, when enough of us stop being villains in other people's stories, even if it means losing our place in our own. The biblical text doesn't give us easy answers. It gives us these complicated figures making comprehensible choices within impossible systems. It gives us mirrors, not monsters. Questions, not conclusions. The discomfort of recognizing ourselves in people we'd rather condemn. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the real theological insight isn't about individual villains. It's about structural evil, about systems that make harm profitable, violence rational, cruelty necessary, about how those systems persist by convincing participants they're not really responsible, about how they collapse, not when we remove bad people, but when we dismantle bad structures, about how that work is slow, costly, ongoing, about how every generation inherits systems and has to choose, perpetuate, or resist. The villains we've examined tonight made their choices. History recorded them. Theology interpreted them. Tradition preserved them, not as cartoons to dismiss, but as humans to understand, not as monsters to condemn, but as mirrors to examine, not as exceptions to our goodness, but as examples of our capacity for rationalized harm. They endure in the text not because they were uniquely evil, but because they were ordinarily human, making the same calculations we make, within systems that reward compliance and punish conscience, convinced they were doing the right thing, or at least the necessary thing, or at minimum the only realistic thing available. And 2,000 years later, we're still making those calculations, still operating within those systems, still finding reasons to compromise, still telling ourselves it's different this time, still becoming villains in stories we don't yet know we're part of. The text preserves them as warnings, not that evil is obvious, that it's ordinary, not that villains are monsters, that they're us. Given the right systems, the right pressures, the right incentives, we see Pharaoh not as ancient history, but as present pattern. We see Caiaphas not as religious villain, but as institutional mirror. We see all of them not gone, but transformed into the systems that outlasted them, the calculations that persist, the compromises that continue, the ordinary evil that wears a human face and speaks in reasonable tones and carries a briefcase full of justifications. That alone endures, long after the individuals have turned to dust.